My name is Kenny Williams, and I am the Vice President of Sunrise Children's Services. We are a private child care organization. We're faith-based, and we serve the Commonwealth of Kentucky as community partners with these wonderful ladies. We have 8 residential centers. We have 14 therapeutic foster care offices. We have counseling services throughout the Commonwealth. We serve all 120 counties, as well as some human trafficking prevention and some other different things. So, thank you for having us.
My name is Vicki Embry, and I'm the Executive Director of CASA, and that stands for Court Appointed Special Advocates. And we are a nonprofit organization that trains community citizens to be volunteers to advocate for kids in court that's been abused or neglected. And they go through a 30-hour training, a screening process, and then a 30-hour training course to do that. Then they're sworn in by a judge to advocate for the child that's in the court system. And they do that by just interviewing all parties involved with that child, visiting the child in their home or foster home or wherever their placement is, sometimes in their schools, and just kind of keeping the judge up to date on where that child's at in their process through the court system. And they stay with that child throughout the court system until either they're reunified with parents, they're adopted, or the case is taken off the docket and no longer in court.
My name is Michelle Bays. I work for the Cabinet for Health and Family Services. That is more commonly known as social services. I did frontline child protection investigation for 10 years, where I went out and investigated all the allegations of child abuse and neglect here in Owensboro. Since that time, I have now moved into a specialist position, which is more of like a consultant. So now I talk to the frontline staff, and I consult with them on their high-risk cases and advise them and give them advice as far as, you know, what steps need to be taken next. I've been with the state for, it'll be 14 years in May. Okay. All right, and I think we're going to get started with me because it all kinds of, I think you guys have been reading The Orphan Train. And so basically if a child is in foster care, which is what we call it now, it starts with us. It starts with the cabinet. We are the ones that investigate child abuse and neglect. Where we get those reports from is from the community, from the school system, from neighbors, from family members, doctors, attorneys. Everybody is mandated by law to report child abuse or neglect. If they suspect anything, if they have any concerns, it's better to call and report than not say anything. Once that report is made, it is screened by our centralized intake team, and they decide whether it meets criteria or not. The first time it may not be enough. We may not have enough information to go out and do anything, but it's documented in our computer system. The second time still may not be enough for us to investigate, but we have that information. And then third time we get a call, we go out there, and then we look at the history. Every case, we look at the history, and we see what else has been reported. So we use that information to make sure that the child is safe and make sure that, you know, the parents are doing everything they can to protect the child. So when the investigative worker gets a call, we usually within 24 hours are out there seeing the child first. We have the right to go into any school and interview the child without the parent's permission, because we want to see the child, see the injuries, talk to them without getting the parents a chance to coach or, you know, talk to the kids first. And the school is usually a safe environment for them. They feel protected there. So that's why we go to the schools and we talk to the kids. We talk to any siblings that may be there in the home as well. We talk to the school system. We talk to doctors. We talk to whoever is involved in that family's life that may have information. So we talk to all of these people. We talk to mom. We talk to dad. And based on that, we decide what needs to happen next. I would say the majority of our cases initially are unsubstantiated, where we don't find that they have abused or neglected their children. They may need some help in some areas, but they haven't been abusive or neglectful. But let's say we do have a case where we do find abuse or neglect. If we don't find anything, it's done. We close out, the end of story. They don't see us again unless another report is made. If we do find abuse or neglect, some people think, like what you see in the media, we go out, we rip the kids out of the home in the middle of the night, kicking and screaming, all of that. That doesn't happen. We try as hard as we can to not pull the kids out of the home, because that's even more traumatic for them. It's secondary trauma. So what we do, we try to see what services we can put in the home to help them. Let's say they disciplined and too roughly and the child had marks, bruises on the bottom. In that case, we have services called Family Preservation Program that we contract with, and they will go into the home 8 to 10 hours a week and provide services to the family, intensive services, and they will work with them on what DCBS, which is the cabinet, what we see needs to be addressed. They will also work with them on what the family sees that they need help with. The family might say, you know, we're really struggling with budgeting and paying our bills. Can you help us with that? That's not an area that we identified, but sure, absolutely. Whatever the family sees as a stressor to them, they will help them with that. And that program lasts about 4 weeks. They have other programs as well, but that is our most intensive that we can put in there. They have other programs that last up to 3 months. However, they're not in the home as often as 8 to 10 hours. So that's one service we can do. We can also refer them to mental health treatment. We have, it's called the Targeted Assessment Program through the University of Kentucky, and they are in our office, and they will do free mental health, substance abuse, domestic violence, and learning disability. They do screenings for all of that, all of those areas, and they will help the client get into treatment if that's what their identified need is. We also have a program called the START Team, which is just for substance abusing parents. And they will work with the family. We have beds reserved at all of the treatment centers in the community, where if we have a family that needs a parent that needs intensive substance abuse treatment, we can get them in a treatment program within a matter of days now, where before it was almost impossible. So there's a lot of things that we will do with the kids and the families before we ever get to the point of removal. Let's say that the kids do have to come out for a short period of time. We will look for relatives first. We're going to look for the grandparents, the aunts, the uncles, cousins, anybody that can take care of the kids. We will look for them first because they know them. They're going to be more comfortable going with a relative than they would a complete stranger. So, of course, we check the relatives' homes. We do criminal background checks and make sure that they're going to a safe environment, that we're not putting them into a situation that could be worse for them. So we will put them with relatives, and as a last resort, we will put them in foster care. And just to give you a little idea of the numbers of what we're talking about the kids currently in foster care in Kentucky, we have 7,603 kids that are in foster care. Out of those kids, 2,217 have the goal of adoption, which means that the parents' rights have been terminated and they're looking for their forever families. The rest of those, we're still working with the parents. We're still trying to get those kids home. More so than not, that's what happens. The kids return home with their parents after working with us and reducing the risk that were previously there. Now, if that can't happen, then we do terminate the parents' rights. And when we terminate rights, it terminates on grandparents, aunts, uncles, everybody. And that kid is now available for adoption. Here locally, which is the Two Rivers region, which goes Owensboro, Bowling Green, and then all these little surrounding counties in between. There's 17 counties total. So in our area, it's 889 kids that we are currently working with in this area. And 199 of those kids are available for adoption. And when I give you these numbers, these are all the kids that are in foster care. So they are our kids. They're the state of Kentucky's kids. All of the social workers for the cabinet, we are monitoring those kids. We are making sure that their needs are met. We are making sure that they have a safe place to go, checking in on them as often as we can. So these are our kids.
You're next.
Oh,
Go next.
I was going to say, I was just hanging on your every word. So I was like, and what happens next? Well, that would be me. I think that Sunrise is one of a handful of private child care organizations. We happen to be the largest in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And our roles, we kind of have two different aspects of our lives. First of all is the prevention, which is something that we work very closely with, because our goal as community partners, as mental health, as child welfare professionals, is to keep children with their families. That's our main goal, guys. I mean, sometimes people have that odd things that we were laughing yesterday about, that we have like an ice cream truck or whatever, and we just troll the neighborhoods and grab children and things like that. That's a horrible Lifetime movie that you really should never watch. That's not what we are at all. Our whole goal is to keep families in place and to keep them safe and keep kids safe so they can grow up to be productive adults. So Sunrise, we have a prevention side, which we actually provide in-home counseling. It's like an outpatient service, but we work directly in the community. So we can go into schools, we can go into churches, we go into the home itself and work with the families. We do a lot of targeted case management, help them to identify resources. Again, those children are in the custody of their families, and so our whole goal is so that they don't move to removal for any point, and that we try to, as much as possible, keep them out of the court system in order for them to just be maintained. If a child is removed from the home, if the cabinet does not have a foster home themselves that they work with, a lot of times in private child care, we work with large sibling groups. We work with more severely emotionally, kids that have mental health issues, that they're going to need a lot more in regards to that. We do specialty homes, Spanish speaking, deaf children, and also have programs where I work with juvenile justice children who have been removed from their homes because they've committed a crime. So I work more in specialty care in regards to that. So those children come in our homes. If it's a very severe case, they may go into one of our residential programs across the Commonwealth of Kentucky. So we have a different aspect. The orphan train is very important to us at Sunrise because we are the organization that was connected to the orphan train very early on. Of course, as you all know, having read and things like that and studied, the orphan train began in 1854 and ran through 1929. In 1854, it was identified in Boston and New York. There were about 3,700 children that were identified as needing placement, and the cities of Boston and New York were just overwhelmed. They just simply could not do it. So what would actually happen is they would literally put them on cattle cars. Initially, in 1854, for the first 10 years of the orphan train was not the best situation. They were just trying to move the children. By the time of the late 1920s and things like that, they were living high on the hog. They had Pullman cars and sleeper cars and things like that. It was a much different world. But Sunrise actually began in June 30th, 1869. We've been in effect for 147 years on the very first day. And what happened was the Commonwealth of Kentucky was a border state during the Civil War. So families fought families, brothers fought brothers. There was a lot of children that were left after the aftermath of the Civil War, literally living on the streets. And at that time, Department of Social Services wasn't in effect. We didn't have those type of things. We didn't have government support. We didn't have, basically it was the churches and the community. And so what happened was a women's group in a church in downtown Louisville said, you know what, we've got all of these kids that are living and dying on our streets in downtown Louisville. We need to do something about that. So June 30th, they opened the basement of their church and admitted 5 children. And from that day forward, for the next 147 years, Sunrise, we've changed our names a couple of times and things, so everybody does that. But we have not missed a day of care. This morning, 632 children woke up in a Sunrise bed in one of our residential and foster care. Another 174, I had to check, we had intakes yesterday, 174 children actually working in our community counseling and prevention program, and then we have probably about another 30 that we work with on an international basis. One of our emphasis is foster care. One of our emphasis is adoption, because that's our connection back to 1869. And this is actually a picture, things like that. This is our Glendale campus and things like that. Glendale actually was established. It's outside in Hardin County, rural Hardin County. 580 acres. It's a working farm type environment, type situation. And it was actually established when we started on June 30th, 1869. We were in downtown Louisville and remained there, and then we finally moved out to Middletown and things like that. The Glendale campus actually came because we entered into a partnership with the Nashville Railroad, which of course is L&N Railroad and things. And we had an agreement with them that one, as part of the orphan train, children could be transported because it literally split the Commonwealth of Kentucky, or if there was a child that was designated in need or in crises and things, and someone found them. We were kind of like Department of Social Services before they came about. They could take them to any train station, and for free, L&N would let them ride. And this was one of our campuses. Glendale actually was established in the early 1900s, and this right here is the railroad track. It runs parallel to I-65, and still in effect today. And what would happen is they would come through Glendale. all hours of the day and night. The train would work, and they would stop at the cross of this main road right here. This is Glendale Road. Things like that. Right here in this little grove of trees, this was the caretaker or the person who was in charge of the campus at that time. But right here's a little crossroad, and they would actually stop there. The train blows its whistle, even till today. We have a kind of a partnership agreement before they cross that main road right there. And they would stop if they had a child on the train, and they would walk. It's a beautiful white marble arch, and I did not have a picture of it, and I apologize. And they would actually be told, you walk through this arch, and you follow a path, which you can see kind of right here, that would lead to, this is our main administration building. There's always a light that's held there, 24/7, 365, and things like that, that front porch and things like that. And they were told if you walk through the arch and things like that, follow the light, and then you would ring the bell and then you'd find Jesus, because we're a faith-based organization. So this is actually the campus itself. These are cottages and things like that, and that's the main building, and that's the we call it the mess hall. It's the dining hall and things like that, where we would sit. At one point, we had, when I was actually the program director at Glendale, we were there. I had 72 children that lived on campus. I had 80 working staff that we ran the farm and all the direct care staff and things like that. And at mealtime, at lunch, when the dinner bell actually rang, we would all assemble here for our meal and things like that. So this is the picture of the campus itself. This next one is a picture, and this is getting ready for Glendale Days. Every year, we still hold Glendale Days, but twice a year, up until like the 1950s, what would happen is, because there wasn't a formal adoption process, a government agency that actually oversaw that, children that were eligible for adoption, that did not have families and things, one thing I didn't point out yesterday is when I joined Glendale back in 1990, it was still not unusual for a child to come to that campus and live there for 8 to 10 years. That was not an unusual kind of thing, guys. We actually had children that would come as young children, like would be preschool, and they would actually graduate from us. And when they aged out at 18, they would leave the farm, or they would come to work for us and things like that. But this would be back in the early, probably the 1930s, probably 1920s maybe, and things like that, late 20s. And you'll see the kids, they have on bonnets, they have on these beautiful little dresses and things. What would happen is once a year, literally, the kids would get all dressed up. People from churches and people that were looking to expand their family or adopt and things would travel to Glendale, to our campus, and we would have a meal on the grounds. You have to remember, we are from the Kentucky Baptist Convention, things like that. So we all have a big meal, and then kids would actually be put up on an apple box or on these front steps and things like that, or on a wagon. And I've actually read the ledgers where it would say, this is little Susie, we think she's 3 to 4 years old, she's a good eater, has good teeth and things like that, and needs a family. And people would say, I'll take her, and things like that. So it wasn't unusual that children were adopted. There wasn't a real strong process back then. Sometimes it was just a couple of signatures and things like that, and children would actually be adopted that day, and they would leave and things, and they would go on, and they would we have adoption from all over the country into we can actually track 17 different countries where some of our kids went military and things like that, and they stayed in the country that they were serving and still do and things. And we still code Glendale Days. It's an alumni event once a year. It's the last Sunday in June and things like that. We have it there on the campus with a meal on the grounds and all of those good things. We no longer put kids up on apple carts or make them wear bonnets for adoption and things like that. Some of the staff, I'd like to do that. No, I'm just kidding. That's right. This is Gardner Hall, a picture from the railroad tracks itself. This would be the path that the kids would follow, and this is where the light is and different things like that. But this is one of our main buildings and things like that. So
We want to go to Glendale Days.
Yeah.
oh, well, actually, I can get you all an invitation and kind of like that. It's a fun thing, and things like that. And this is actually in the dining hall itself. And what would happen is everyone would sit down at a table and things like that, and you will see all the food on the tables and things like that. A lot of it was actually grown right there on the farm and things like that. Animals and things like that we would actually slaughter on the farm and different things. Even as far back as when I was at Glendale, we had cattle, beef cattle, we had hogs, we had goats and things like that. And if something, one would, well, if we would slaughter one of those on a regular basis, that's what we had for a meal and things like that. And it was kind of a party time whenever it was time to slaughter a cow or whatever, because we were going to eat really good for a long period of time. But we keep an active garden. Even today in our newer facility, we keep an active garden so the kids can grow and things like that. We also have a huge 4-H program where kids were actually gifted with an animal, and they were in charge of raising that animal and grooming that animal. They could take it to 4-H competitions, and any money that they receive, any prizes and things like that, that money actually stays with them into a specialized account that they can take with them and things. And then if the animal is actually sold, and what would happen is it would get to a point that we could sell that animal, those proceeds would also go with the child to help them start their lives and different things like that. So it's one of our things that we would do. So when you all are reading the orphan train, and I'll stop because I know Vicki needs to talk, those are not real, I mean, trying to think of the nice way. Dinah and Ralph are not ideal foster parents, okay? Those are not people that we are actually recruiting and that would actually take care of children. There are situations, guys, that you will see that are not ideal situations. That's not the way life really is in foster care. We look more for like the Murphys towards the end and things like that. But I'm very thankful for the book. And when I was talking to Ms. Brown and things like that, and that you all decided on the orphan train as a community reading project, I was excited about that because of those situations, because of the tragedies that you see written there, created the reform to what child welfare is today. It really wasn't until the end of the 1920s, beginning of the 1930s, that child welfare was originally looked at. It, actually, Vicki and I were talking yesterday, it came out of animal activists who were the first one that stepped forward and said, you know what, kids are being treated worse and we have protection for animals, we should do something for kids. Starting in the late 1920s, early 1930s. In 1950s and 60s, child welfare would go under a massive and things. I teach a little class about this. It's a 8-hour class, and I know you're thinking, shut up now, and things like that. But it actually talks about the progression of child welfare, even today. As our legislative body is meeting today and things like that, we have bills that are on the floor being voted on in committee today in regards to child welfare and the reforms that we're going through because of situations that Molly and Vivian and those that experienced. So I'm very thankful that the college community took orphan train on, and that you realize that there is a need out there. There's a desperate need for foster parents. There's a desperate need, and that's what we're here about. We want to show you that child welfare is progressive, that we care, that there's a compassion you don't see on those movies or even on the film where the guy's like playing on his phone while the interaction. You don't see the tears. You don't see the prayer that we go through. You don't see that we are called to do this work. This is what our passion is to make sure those families are as safe as possible and to keep them intact. And if they can't be, that we find forever families for those children. Because every child deserves a family. Every child deserves to have an opportunity to be the best person they possibly can be. And that's why we do what we do. So.
You stole my opening line about the animal activists.
I'm sorry.
Womp,
Womp, womp. Things like that.
No, I'm just kidding. I like to give Kenny a hard time. Exactly what they've already just said, that you've read accounts, horrific accounts in the orphan train book. And not that we're not recognizing that there were those issues, but we also want to shed light on how far we have came. And it took stories like that, real life stories like that, to just like now about anything that we go through, just to change people's perception of things and how they look at things, and to be strong advocates against that kind of injustice and make the changes in the federal laws that took place. And since you do that class, we go over that in CASA training, so maybe you could come do our child welfare history training component. And Kenny and I were talking about that yesterday, that we teach that in our CASA training class when we talk about the history of child welfare before there was such institutes as social services involved, institutions like that. A child appeared in the court system and she'd been extremely neglected from her own parents from years, and someone went to an animal activist who was a well-known animal activist and said, why isn't someone advocating for this child? I mean, this is a human being. And he went into the court system on behalf of her, and his experience was with animal advocacy. But that got a lot of attention, and it took things like that and to get to where we are today. And as far as CASA, I just want to give you a little bit of history about CASA, and I hope you just understand, you leave today, understand the importance of it takes a community to protect children.
Yeah.
And one thing I really want to reiterate that Michelle said earlier about reporting abuse or neglect. Often when I go speak, I hear people say things like, well, they don't do anything, you report it. Like she said, it may take 2 or 3 times of them going out before they actually find, say, the evidence or something that's really there that these families have abused or neglected their children, or it may be cases that they haven't, but in someone else's eyes they feel like they have. But that should not deter us from reporting, and don't think that you have to have facts, you have to have evidence, you have to investigate it yourself. I mean, that's what they're there for. They're the investigators to do that. And there is a trail, like she said, even if you feel like, well, I called and no one came out, and I called again. And one, you don't know if anybody came out. They like she said, they go to schools, they interview lots of different people. That's why I tell people, I was like, well, how do you know they didn't go out? So there's just probably, I think, a lot of myths behind even reporting, and it's so important to report because there are kids being abused that reports are not made, and they can't do anything about it until we know that something's going on. So I encourage you to exercise that right and mandate. We are mandated to report child abuse or neglect if you ever think a child's been abused. CASA started, and I said earlier, it stands for Court Appointed Special Advocates. It started in the 1970s. A Seattle, Washington judge who was working with community partners. He's working with social services. He's working with attorneys, mental health professionals, medical professionals, all those people that play a key part when kids have been abused or neglected and they're in the court system. But he was realizing that the system was overburdened, and not any fault to one particular entity in that system, but he just realized that it was an overburdened system. And he sometimes felt like as a judge, he had to sit on the bench and make decisions on behalf of children that could be life-changing decisions, and he didn't always have all the information that he wanted to have to do that and feel comfortable doing that. So he ran an article in a newspaper and asked that community citizens, they did not have to be social workers, they did not have to be law enforcement, mental health professionals, just people who were passionate and cared about children and wanted to help protect children, if they would just volunteer their time to follow up on these kids that are in the court system. And that's really all he was asking from them. And he got an overwhelming response, and that's when CASA started on a smaller scale in 1970s in Seattle, Washington, and they're still one of the biggest programs now. There's 2,100 CASA programs in the United States. We have 22 in the state of Kentucky, and our local program has been here in Davis County since 1996, and we've also expanded into Ohio County and serving that court jurisdiction as well. So a lot of people may ask, well, why do you need a CASA? You have a social worker. Michelle's already told you and gave a really great explanation of what social services does. You have these foster parents that if the children can't remain safely in the home, even though that is the first goal, is that the children remain in their home or obviously be reunified with the parent. But if that can't happen and they have to go into foster care, then why do you need these CASA people? And what CASA does is they just partner with all the people already involved with the child. They're an extra eyes and ears for that child that's in the court system. CASAs usually carry one case. We may have some that carry 2, and I can tell you, before we let a CASA even carry 2, they have to be somebody that really we know stays on top of their cases, is very passionate, a seasoned advocate that knows what they're doing. So usually they just have one case. So they can concentrate all their time to this one case, where a social worker does not have that luxury of doing that. They may have a caseload. What's your average caseload now? 20-something to 30, isn't it?
For an ongoing worker who carries, like after abuse or neglect has been found, it moves to ongoing, they are averaging 20 to 30, sometimes mid-30 is the number of cases they have. The investigators, it depends on what county you're in and what the staffing situation is like. In Davis County right now, I think they may have up to 40 some odd cases because we've had such turnover lately.
So this is a social worker who they're supposed to see these kids once a month. That's what they're required to do. They're having to see these kids, do all this paperwork, which anytime you're dealing with the government, the paperwork's atrocious. They're going to deal with this paperwork, be in court when they need to be in court, and transporting kids. I mean, it's just unreal, all these responsibilities they have to do. So they can't be as intensive in seeing these kids or these families. So it's not that they're not doing their job or attorneys aren't. Well, some aren't attorneys. But it's not that, these people are not doing their jobs. It's just an extra person to be in there to work alongside with these other community service providers to see what the best interest of that child is. So what CASAs do is they just interview, we call them fact gatherers. We ask them to give as much factual information as possible, not their opinion, but factual information of what's going on with these kids. Social services will have a safety plan or a plan that the family has to work with, and that's what's recognizing why they're in the court system, what needs to change to make their kids be safer in their homes or for their kids to be able to return. So CASAs are privy to that information. They know what that plan is. They know what the parents are supposed to be working on, and they follow up with that to see, are the parents going to domestic violence counseling? Are they going to their AA meetings? And I mean, they've had people call the AA where they say they're going to meetings and check up on them and see that they're doing that. They visit the kids in homes, foster care, schools, interview neighbors, family members, mental health professionals, school. We work very closely with the school personnel. And then they submit a court report to that judge saying, this is what we see going on in this child's life. And we often have you'll hear like our slogan, I guess, so to speak, is their voice for the child. They also let the judge know what that child wants. If we have a child that tells us, I want to go back home. I know my parents have done these things, but I love my parents, I want to go back home. We tell the judge that. Now, the CASA may say, I feel like in the best interest of the child, for them to be able to go back home, the parents need to complete such and such and such on their case plan. Or they haven't followed the case plan that social services set forth, or things like that. We had a child last summer, a 16-year-old boy that said, I'm telling you, if I go back home, I will fail. There are no boundaries for me there, and my mom has all these issues, and I will fail, and I do not want to fail. I want to stay where I'm at. I want to stay in foster care. We felt like the judge needed to hear that. That they need to hear. Here was a 16-year-old boy that knew his limitations, knew the lack of boundaries and what he needed, and that mom needed to hear that, and everyone involved with that child, that this is a 16-year-old that's now telling you what he needs in order to be able to thrive and be a successful individual himself, and what his mom needed to help him to do that. So when we say we're a voice for a child, that's what that means. We want to let the people in that court system know, because often these kids feel like they're unheard. They feel like all these adults up here are making these decisions on their behalf, and they don't care about what they think. Or kind of in the video you watch Removed, I mean, that little girl says things to allude to that. Does anyone care what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling? And that I want to see my brother, and things like that. So they're looking at how often are visits going on between mom and the kids. How they often observe visits between the parents and the child. They don't supervise the visits. That's still the role of social services, but they'll observe those visits and make documentation and court reports of how those visits appear to be going, or do they have sibling contact? Can they have more sibling contact? And what can we do to see that happens? So that's the kind of things that they work on. We also recently, in the past few years, as a local program, have wanted to look more at prevention. We do provide these volunteer intervention services after a child's in the court system, but then we wanted to look at what can we do to help prevent children from being in the court system in the first place. So April's National Child Abuse Month, and we do like a community workshop every year that's free to the community on different topics that may help protect children or families. Dr. Curry from the University of Louisville has come twice to our workshops and done the head trauma workshops, or shaken baby syndrome, that you may be familiar with that terminology. We've done suicide training, suicide prevention, bullying, sexual abuse trainings, so many different things. A statistic, if you don't know, 1 out of 4 girls and 1 out of 6 boys by the age 18 will be sexually abused. So that means all of us in this room know a child, more than likely, that's been sexually abused. No, we might not know of the abuse, but there's a child in our midst that's been sexually abused. Those are horrific statistics, and those are real-life statistics, unfortunately. So it does take all these community partners and people in the community, people like yourself that are here educating yourself, to know these things to be able to protect children. And I also wanted to say, I talked more about this yesterday, I also was a foster parent for 8 years for the cabinet, and I've adopted 2 children that I had in foster care, and I also work for the program that Michelle mentioned earlier, the Family Preservation Program. And so those are, again, just, different ways that people can make a difference in the lives of children. And I can tell you as a foster parent, years ago, there wasn't a lot put in place to screen foster parents and to monitor foster parents. I mean, I dated a guy in high school that his father was adopted. He was in foster care and adopted, and he said that adoptive father beat him, and he worked on the farm, and he adopted 4 boys to work them like dogs on a farm, and he beat them almost daily. But there weren't a lot, and he was, an older gentleman, but there weren't a lot of things in place then to screen foster parents and to monitor them like there is now. And there's a rigorous process that you go through to become a foster parent. Does that mean there's not bad foster parents? Well, there's bad police officers, there's bad teachers. We have that in life, unfortunately. There's good and bad, but that doesn't mean the few bad apples makes the whole system flawed. For the most part, like Kenny said, the foster parents are more like the Murphys. Is that the name of the family? More like the Murphys in the book, that they care and they're compassionate about children. And foster parents are needed. We talked about that yesterday. They're desperately needed. There's just not enough to take on the burden of how many kids are entering into foster care and need good, loving families. And that's how I started the process of thinking of becoming a foster parent. I was a family preservation worker. I was working a case in Union County where several siblings were removed from the home and they were separated, and there was a lot of domestic violence in the home. And I knew from being a worker and working with this family intensively that these kids were so attached, probably more so than most siblings, because they ran to each other for protection. When abuse was happening between the parents, they would all crawl under the bed together and hold each other. So when I thought of them being separated, it just broke my heart, and I was frustrated and I was angry. I was a new worker and I was green, and so I kind of told the social worker off, so I thought, and I was like, why would you do that? And that's not in the best interest of these kids. And I just kind of ranted, and then she just threw her arms up and said, find me a foster home in Union County that'll take in 4 kids, and I'll take them right now. You can go with me. That was her reply to me, because they just were not there. The foster family was not available to take in these kids, so they did have to separate them. So that's why we need foster families. So we need foster families. We need volunteers for these organizations we work for. We need people to be educated in this field and be able to make those referrals and educate other people. You can leave here and tell other students, things that you've learned today, and be proactive in your community and making a difference. Getting an education in the field and working in that field, whether you work in the field or you just want to volunteer, or just be proactive. And if you see something that doesn't seem right, report it. And that's all you have to do. And then let those people who are trained and skilled determine if abuse. It's not on your shoulders. Let them determine if abuse takes place. I have advocates say, well, what if I make the wrong recommendation in court? Or what if I do this wrong, or I don't do that right? Ultimately, that's that judge's decision. And the social worker is always going to have their report and submit what they say and what they feel. We are just another person, another eyes and ears, and a neutral party. Unfortunately, sometimes social services gets a bad rap. When somebody's involved with social services, they have an open case, they may not want to confide to that social worker. They kind of do, more so than you would think. I always thought that was kind of surprising. They just spill their guts. But a lot of times they'll look at that social worker in a negative aspect because they feel like they're in trouble. And in a sense they are, but they don't always see them as a support system. And a CASA can come in and be neutral and kind of maybe gain some trust and rapport there that maybe the social worker struggles in gaining, but still be able to share that information with the worker, what's going on, and maybe even get that family to understand, here's your strengths, here's your weaknesses, this is what social services wants to see happen within your family unit. They do want your kids to stay in the home, they do want your kids to return, and just kind of reiterate to them some of those things that's maybe being said to them, but they don't understand, or they haven't accepted that or come full circle with that. So that's what CASA is. We're mainly just a community partner, volunteer-based. I'm amazed every day that these people do this for free. They go in the homes, they visit these kids, they put themselves in difficult situations, go to court, which can be very intimidating. I'm still intimidated sometimes in court, and I've been in this field for a while. So they put themselves out there on the line because they care about kids.
Just one story real quick to follow up on the importance of reporting abuse or neglect. Here in Kentucky, in our region, we had a little boy. He's 4 years old now. The neighbor just kept seeing him outside and kept noticing bruises on him, on his face and arms. It was summertime, and so she just kept noticing more and more bruises. She didn't know the family very well, other than hi, how are you, when they passed each other outside. But something just didn't sit right, so she finally made a report. She called us. She didn't know names. She didn't know any information. She just knew that this little boy just kept having unexplained bruises, and it just didn't feel right to her. So we go out there, and it's a hard case to talk about. But, I mean, if she hadn't called, he would have died. He had severe internal injuries, broken bones. I mean, just thinking of that case, like, if you have concerns, you have to make a report. Because if she hadn't, he would have died. The question was to explain the court process for a child if they enter the court system. The cabinet can file a petition on behalf of the child and just ask for the court to monitor. We don't always ask for removal. We just sometimes file a petition and leave the kids in the home. And that gains the parents' cooperation, and they have a court order now to cooperate with us and complete the programs. We don't do that on all cases, just some of our more severe ones. Every case we file follows the same process. There's the arraignment is the first hearing. Then after the arraignment, and that's kind of just where the parents are notified of what the petition is, what the allegations are against them. They're appointed attorneys if they cannot afford their own. And then it gets set for a pretrial conference. That's when the social worker, the county attorney, the attorneys for the parents all sit down, and the child is appointed an attorney too, a guardian ad litem. We all sit down, talk about the case, see if we can come to an agreement as far as what's going to happen next. If that doesn't happen, then it gets set for an adjudication, and that is a hearing to find out if what the cabinet filed the petition on, if the judge feels that we had enough evidence to file that, and the judge makes a finding of abuse or neglect or dependency. Dependency is that the best way to explain it is by no fault of the parent did the child suffer in some way. So if the parent is low functioning and it's not their fault, they're not intending to, but they weren't able to meet the child's needs, that kind of thing. But I say that, there's those 4 steps there, but it can drag on for a very long time. The pretrial conferences tend to get reset several times, trying to work things out so that we don't have to have a big hearing and bring everybody in. After the judge makes his finding at the adjudication, then it's set for the disposition, where the cabinet's case plan that we develop with the family is kind of put into court order at that point. And then it is followed until the cabinet says, I think we can take this off the docket. So if we have a case open for 2 years, they could be involved with the court system for 2 years. So.
And CASA doesn't come in until after the adjudication process. So, I knew you were going there. So, yeah, after the adjudication process, then if CASA gets appointed, they can be, a social worker can ask for us to be appointed, a family member can, the judge can appoint us, or we can ask. If we're in court and we hear that case and we think it's a case, oftentimes we have grandparents call us that want us appointed to a case. Like we talked about yesterday, they're very strong advocates for their grandchildren. They may call our office and we'll find out when it's on the docket and we'll go. And if we think it's a case we should be on, or we'll ask the judge. Sometimes we'll call the social worker on the case and see if they want to see if we should be appointed. So there's lots of different ways we can be appointed. And then a CASA stays on that case. Ideally, we want that CASA to stay on that case throughout the whole court process until that child's out of the system. That's another thing. Our mission is to be this consistent person for that child throughout their court process. And there's oftentimes my favorite time for a CASA is when they can stand there on an adoption day and they've been with these kids throughout the process, or they're a reunified home and they know that case is off the docket, this kid's safely home, this family has made these adjustments they need to make, and they no longer are on that case. So that's how we get involved.
The question was about adoptions and the frequency of adoption. Typically, the kids reunify home with their parents more so than the rights are terminated and they are available for adoption. Currently, right now, like I said, we have 889 kids in our care in this region right now, and out of those, 199 are available for adoption. So the rest of those we're working on reunifying. So those 199 have all had their rights terminated, and we're looking for their forever family. Now, as far as how long the rights are terminated, they're available for adoption. How long until they get adopted? It is a case-by-case situation. Some kids are immediately placed in a foster home. That's also an adoptive home, and rights get terminated, and they're like, yes, we want to keep them. and that adoption goes pretty smoothly without any disruption to the child. Sometimes we have the older kids that are harder to adopt. We have large sibling groups that we want to try to keep together, and those kids are harder to adopt. So once rights are terminated for these kids, they go on a website, and it's called Special Needs Adoption Program, SNAP, the SNAP program. And those kids are on a website, and they're available for adoption. Anybody can contact the cabinet and ask about any of those kids. And when you hear the term special need, it's not necessarily that they have a disability or mental health issues or things like that. It's just they're hard to adopt. They could have some mental health issues, but it could be that they're an older teenager. It could be that there's 5 kids, siblings, and so to keep them all together. So
We just looked at that website this morning. This is two of my staff here, and we went on the website this morning just because one of the staff wasn't aware of it, and so I showed it to her. And I don't know if this helps in perspective, but when I was a foster parent for 8 years, I only had 2 sets of children that were adopted. Out of all the kids that I had in foster care in 8 years, and one set was 2 girls that I adopted, and the other children, there was some other children that were. So 2 families that went through the TPR process, termination of parental rights process, and adopted in 8 years. So that kind of gives you an idea. It's not statistics, I know, but gives you an idea that most children are reunified with their parents.
But for those that don't, we are striving for forever families. We work as community partners. It's our goal for them to have forever families. Sunrise, in the last 3 years, I'm about to do my 247th adoption. And we specialize in adoption on those difficult cases in regards to children, teenagers, and things like that. One of my biggest celebrations is teenage adoptions. I'm an adoptive parent. I love the adoption process. It's a passion of mine. There's a member of in every one of my offices that's what their goal is to work when families get to that point. So we get excited about that. But we're working. I mean, we celebrate adoptions. Every adoption is special to all of us. We celebrate them. There's adoptions that go on in Owensboro weekly and things like that. I mean, I can very clearly say that. But there's still a need. There's 2,000 children in the Commonwealth of Kentucky right now under DCBS care that deserve a forever family. And I guarantee you that Michelle, Vicki, and I, and all of our teams are not going to be happy until we can get that number down to 0.
Mom!
What?
You can't find Ichabod.
What?
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. There are thousands of teens in foster care who would love to put up with you.